Yo, what's up guys? Welcome back to another video on the Gooners and Gloves Podcast channel. In today's video, I'm going to be giving you guys my thoughts and predictions for the Alexander Usyk versus Daniel Dubois fight. Obviously, this is an absolutely massive fight for the undisputed heavyweight world championship at Wembley. This is a rematch of the first fight. Obviously, the first fight ended in very controversial circumstances. Daniel Dubois hit Alexander Usyk with a shot, which many people contest whether it was a low blow or a legitimate body shot. Officially, it was ruled a low blow, and as a result, Usyk was given time to recover and eventually was able to get the stoppage a bit later on in the fight. But there are also many people who feel that it was a legit body shot and that he should have been counted out and that Daniel Dubois should have had his hand raised and won the world championship. So of course, a very controversial ending to the fight, and that has now led to Wembley Stadium for the rematch. Obviously, Alexander Usyk looking to become a two-time undisputed heavyweight world champion, because as you may remember, he did become undisputed against Tyson Fury, but was then immediately stripped because he didn't he didn't fight Filip Hrgović for the IBF title, so was therefore stripped. However, since then, Daniel Dubois has beaten both Hrgović and Joshua and is now the legitimate IBF world champion, and is putting up his IBF belt against Alexander Usyk to officially unify the full division, and so we can have an undisputed heavyweight world champion. So Usyk looking to become a two-time undisputed heavyweight world champion, and Daniel Dubois of course looking to achieve the feat for the first time. So huge fight. It really can't be understated how massive this fight is. It's one of the biggest in heavyweight boxing for a long time. Obviously, there have been some really big ones, but this is certainly up there. Absolutely massive, a huge rematch. There's just so much here. I mean, you got the undisputed belts, you got two solid fighters, you obviously have a huge clash of styles, and most importantly, you've got the super controversial ending of the first fight, which has now built this fight up into an even bigger fight for the second one. So really big fight. Of course, I'm absolutely buzzing and can't wait for it. I think it's going to be an amazing fight. So as always, I'm going to give you guys my thoughts on how I think the fight's going to go, who I think is going to win, talk about their styles, and ultimately just who I think will have their hand raised and walk out of Wembley Stadium with the undisputed world heavyweight championship. So of course, let's first get into the records as I usually would. So Alexander Usyk's record is stellar at 23-0 with 14 knockouts. In my opinion, one of the only undefeated records in boxing that's truly legitimate. Obviously, many fighters have padded records as their undefeated record, but Alexander Usyk is certainly no such fighter. He's got one of the most stacked resumes in world boxing today. He's fought only the best. He's seriously, the amount of top level talents that he's fought and beaten is absolutely incredible. So Alexander Usyk truly one of the best in the world today, and his resume is truly one of the best in the world as well. His resume is absolutely fantastic. He's only fought top level opposition, he's only fought the best, and as a result, he has what in my opinion is a true undefeated record full of very difficult and very dangerous fighters which he's managed to dethrone. However, Daniel Dubois is certainly no pushover, 22-2 with 21 knockouts. So obviously Daniel Dubois has huge power. He's a very scary fighter to fight, as we saw in Joshua and also the Hrgović fights. He's a terrifying fighter to fight, and you can see from his knockout percentage, 21 knockouts in 22 wins is nothing to scoff at. That is terrifying power, and that's certainly something that of course Usyk is going to experience, and he did experience the power in the first fight as well, but was of course able to overcome the adversity and eventually get the stoppage. So obviously two experienced fighters, Usyk with 23 fights, Dubois with 24, only 2 losses shared between them. Of course, as I mentioned before, one of Dubois' losses was against Alexander Usyk. However, as I said before as well, it was controversial, and then of course the other loss was against Joe Joyce a few years ago. So certainly a very exciting fight. As you can see, two pretty stacked records. As you can see, Dubois definitely has the power advantage. That's an absolute certainty. Dubois just objectively has more power. Usyk is certainly no light hitter, but as you can see, Usyk is much more of a 12-round fighter, which to be fair, Dubois isn't quite as much of a 12-round fighter as Alexander Usyk. So as you can see, there's strength to both of their records. Obviously in Usyk's case, he's a lot more experienced at going the distance, going the 12 rounds and navigating a full fight, whereas of course Daniel Dubois is much more experienced with landing power shots, getting finishes, getting stoppages, etc. So that's kind of their records. Usyk 23-0 with 14 knockouts, Dubois 22-2 with 21 knockouts. Of course, one of those losses was to Usyk himself, which he's looking to avenge. So in terms of my prediction, I have gone with Alexander Usyk to win by points. Now, I want to be clear, I think this is going to be a tough fight for Usyk. I think this is going to be a hard-fought points victory. However, I do think he's going to be able to get the points victory, and I do believe this fight will go 12 rounds. Obviously, Usyk is very seasoned and experienced at the 12-round distance, having done it quite a lot of times, and especially in the last few fights, so he certainly knows how to navigate the distance. But as I said before, I think it's going to be a really difficult fight for both men. I think this is going to be an absolute brawler. Like, I can really see this fight being one of those just absolutely exhausting, tiring, just exhausting for the fighters, but just amazing for the fans. I could definitely see it being one of those kind of like grueling, just absolutely just dog fights, if you get what I mean. However, I do think that Usyk will be able to come out the other side of it with with a points victory. I do think that Alexander Usyk will be able to outlast and eventually outbox Daniel Dubois. But as mentioned before, I think with how powerful, how explosive Daniel Dubois is, I think it's going to be a really tough decision victory for Usyk, and I could definitely see it being not close, but like I could definitely see it being challenging. I think it could be challenging for Usyk. I think it could be a competitive scoreline, but at the same time, I do think that Usyk will eventually get the victory. So in terms of how I think the fight's going to start, as you can probably imagine, I fully expect Daniel Dubois to start at 100 miles an hour. Obviously, we saw what Daniel Dubois did against both Hrgovic and Joshua. He likes to put the pressure on. Daniel Dubois is a fantastic pressure fighter. He's so good at just relentless pressure and seriously just being all over the opponent. He's so good at that. He's absolutely fantastic at it, and I do think that he's really going to be able to put the pressure on, and he's really going to be able to make this a tough fight for Alexander Usyk. So I do think that to kind of start the fight off, maybe the first like 3 to 4 rounds, I think it's pretty much going to be all Dubois. In my opinion, Usyk's going to want to kind of play the long game in this fight and potentially survive the early pressure. We know that Alexander Usyk likes to read his opponent, make calculations, and ultimately just read the data that his opponent presents him with. And obviously, I do think that for Daniel Dubois, he's just going to be coming out 100 miles an hour, and I think he's going to be all over Usyk. Obviously, there's a couple of things here. First of all, Daniel Dubois is not going to want a repeat of what happened in the first fight. He's going to really want to, establish a proper knockout, establish a very like conclusive finish. Obviously, the first fight's finish was so inconclusive, and ultimately it resulted in him losing. So I'm sure in his case, he's going to want to just have a conclusive finish, an absolute knockout, and just an absolute no questions asked sort of finish. So for that reason, I do expect Daniel Dubois to come out at 100 miles an hour. However, I do think that Alexander Usyk will be able to weather the early storm. We know that Alexander Usyk is really good at fighting back against adversity. In the Joshua fight, the Chisora fight, the first Dubois fight, like in many of his fights, he's been hurt, he's been rocked, he's been really struggling. However, he always finds a way to make it out of those situations. He always finds a way to survive the pressure, to survive, the hard hits, and I do believe in this fight it will be no different. I think he's going to really struggle at first. I think he's going to be hit with some really heavy shots from Dubois early on, but I do think that Usyk will be able to stay calm, stay patient, read the data, and kind of just weather that early storm. So that's kind of how I think the first 3 to 4 rounds are going to go. I think it's very much going to be Daniel Dubois all over Usyk, putting on the pressure, just getting Usyk's respect, basically. As we move on to the mid stages, I think this is when Usyk is going to start to come into it a little bit. I think this is when Usyk will have kind of understood the rhythm of Dubois, the pressure of Dubois, and will start to throw together his own combinations. Obviously, we know that Daniel Dubois has always had a difficulty against southpaws. Daniel Dubois does not like fighting southpaws. He finds it difficult. And of course, Alexander Usyk is one of the best southpaws in the world. So I think Usyk's going to make full use of what he's got, his southpaw boxing. There's no question about it that Alexander Usyk is the better technical boxer. Obviously, Usyk is amateur gold medalist, Olympic gold medalist, world gold medalist, undisputed cruiserweight champion, undisputed heavyweight champion. Like, there's no question about it. The better technical boxer is Alexander Usyk, and he's going to make full use of that. And I think it's going to be very important for him. As I said before, I think Dubois is going to be fast. He's going to be explosive. He's going to be really, in my opinion, he's going to want to turn this into a brawl. That's what I believe Dubois is going to want to do. In the same way he was able to do against Hrgovic and Joshua, I think he's really going to want to turn the fight into a brawl, make it hectic, make it just kind of a dog fight, which Usyk ultimately, isn't particularly great at. He much prefers when it's a chess match, when it's an actual boxing match. So in my opinion, Alexander Usyk in the mid stages of the fight is really going to start to kind of work the fight back to his own pace. Obviously, Usyk prefers a bit of a slower pace where he can, calculate his punches, and ultimately he prefers boxing. He prefers hit and don't get hit. He prefers the sweet science, whereas of course Daniel Dubois, we know, prefers sort of the brawling aspect of boxing. He likes to turn fights into dog fights because ultimately that's how Daniel Dubois likes to fight. He's very much what you would call obviously I don't want to discredit his boxing ability. Of course, he still has boxing IQ. He still knows what he's doing, but I just mean like he prefers the brawling aspect of boxing, if you get what I mean. But that isn't in any way to say that he's not a smart boxer, doesn't have IQ. No, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that. However, he definitely prefers the brawling aspect, whereas of course Alexander Usyk much prefers the chess aspect, the hit and don't get hit, sweet science aspect. And in my opinion, that's going to make this a really, really interesting sort of fight. Is just kind of that clash of styles. So anyway, as I mentioned before, in the mid stages of the fight, once Daniel Dubois maybe starts to tire out a little bit from his initial 100-mile-an-hour pace, I think this is where Alexander Usyk is going to start to put together some combinations, come forward a bit more, walk Daniel Dubois down and ultimately just really start to impose himself into the fight, get a few rounds back, and basically make it a bit more competitive. I think Usyk will also look to start using his head movement, his reflexes, everything. Of course, he's very fast, he's very quick, great reflexes, agile, and I think that's going to be really important against someone as powerful and as hard hitting as Daniel Dubois. So I think the mid stages of the fight is when Alexander Usyk is going to start to work his way into it a bit, start landing some combinations, become a bit more nimble, and ultimately start to win a few rounds back. And then as we get to sort of round 8 onwards, I think this is when Usyk's going to, in my opinion, take control of the fight. I think this is when Daniel Dubois is probably going to be a bit tired, maybe a bit frustrated from obviously struggling to hit Alexander Usyk, and as a result, I think Alexander Usyk is going to start to impose himself more from round 8 onwards. Not only that, but I fully expect Alexander Usyk to make use of body shots in this fight. We know Usyk has absolutely fantastic body shots, and obviously we saw in the first fight that so does Daniel Dubois, but you know, Alexander Usyk is really, really good. He's really good at working the body. He's really good at tiring opponents out. It's something that's consistently allowed him to beat heavyweights that are much bigger than him. You know, Tyson Fury, Anthony Joshua, Chisora, etc. One big reason why he's been able to beat those guys is because of the body shots. He's really good at sucking the wind out of the lungs of the opponent, if you get what I mean. You know, really stiff jabs to the body, stiff hooks to the body, and they really, they drain the air out of the opponent's lungs. And in my opinion, this is what Usyk's going to want to do to Daniel Dubois. He's going to want to drain the air out of his lungs. He's going to want to tire him out. He's going to want to make him, you know, feel defeated essentially. And in my opinion, that's going to be a big part of Usyk's game plan, is to use the body shots to tire Daniel Dubois out and eventually outbox him later on in the fight. So I think from round 8 onward, I think this is when Usyk's going to take control of the fight. I think this is when he's going to be outboxing him, you know, definitely landing good shots and ultimately just seeing out the victory for definitely a difficult, a hard fought, but ultimately relatively comfortable decision victory. So that's my opinion. I believe Alexander Usyk will win by decision, but that being said, it's going to be a very hard fought, a very scrappy, and a very difficult decision victory for Alexander Usyk, because Daniel Dubois is going to have really good pressure, he's going to have really powerful punches, he's going to have good combinations, and ultimately he's really going to want to impose himself as well. He's going to want the knockout, but ultimately I just think Alexander Usyk has the IQ, he's got the fundamentals, he's got the southpaw stance to be able to outbox, out hustle, and eventually outpoint Daniel Dubois on Saturday night. So that's my opinion. Of course, I expect a lot of people will probably be predicting the Daniel Dubois knockout, which is fair enough, don't get me wrong, it's definitely possible, but I just think Alexander Usyk is really hard to knock out, and he's, in my opinion, the much better technical fighter. So when you consider that he's really difficult to knock out and he's, you know, able to outbox Dubois, I just can't see Dubois winning this one. But of course it could happen, don't get me wrong, it absolutely could. Daniel Dubois is a very hard puncher, as we saw with the Joshua fight, and of course Alexander Usyk's chin is not made of, you know, steel or anything. It can be cracked, it can be broken. However, that being said, I just think Usyk has the fundamentals, he's got the IQ, he's got the, you know, the fighting ability to be able to outbox Daniel Dubois. Of course, Alexander Usyk is not stupid. He's not going to try and engage with brawls with Daniel Dubois, because he will lose. You know, Daniel Dubois is obviously a lot bigger. He's obviously much stronger, much more powerful, and Alexander Usyk knows that. One thing about Usyk is that he's always known his limitations, and he knows that in the heavyweight division, he came up from cruiserweight. He's a smaller heavyweight, and that ultimately someone like Daniel Dubois, if he tries to brawl with him or wrestle with him, he's just going to struggle. And this is why Usyk makes use of his boxing ability, his IQ, etc. And in my opinion, that will be enough on Saturday night to get the job done against Daniel Dubois. But don't get me wrong, Daniel Dubois is certainly a threat. He's obviously very powerful, very explosive, great movement, actually quite fast for his size. I will say I definitely think he's a lot faster than his size really should allow him to be, which is definitely a credit to him, how quick he is, and very explosive, very explosive, very quick, very powerful, agile. So this is going to be a very tough fight for Usyk, in my opinion. I think that Dubois is going to put on serious pressure. I think he's going to land very heavy shots. I think Usyk will definitely be hurt once or twice in this fight, but all in all, I think he'll be able to battle back against that adversity, you know, get his combinations going, get his head movement, his, you know, his nimble reflexes, his fast movement, get all of that going, start to put the pressure on, use the body shots, land the head shots, and eventually outpoint Dubois after a very hard fought victory, but ultimately outpoint him and beat him on Saturday night to become the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. So please let me know down below who you think is going to win. It's an absolutely huge fight and I can't wait for it. Obviously Usyk, the more technical fighter who prefers sort of a slower pace, compared to Daniel Dubois, who is very much 100 miles an hour brawler sort of fighter. So a huge clash of styles, of course, orthodox versus southpaw, which always makes for an intriguing dynamic as well. So It's going to be a really, really interesting fight, and I'm really excited for it. So please let me know down below who you think is going to win. Who do you think will walk out on Saturday night with the undisputed heavyweight world championships? I'm really, really looking forward to the fight. I think it's going to be a banger. I think we're in for a treat on Saturday night at Wembley Stadium, and I'm really, really excited for it. So that's my final prediction. Alexander Usyk to win on points. I think it'll be a hard-fought decision victory, but ultimately I do think that Alexander Usyk will get the points victory and will beat Daniel Dubois to become undisputed heavyweight world champion. So that's going to do it for this podcast. Thank you guys so much for listening. I really appreciate all the support recently. Thank you for everything. You guys mean the world to me, as I always say. So thank you all so much for listening to this podcast. Please let me know down below who you think is going to win the Alexander Usyk Daniel Dubois fight. Who do you think will walk out as the undisputed heavyweight world champion? And I'll catch you guys at another podcast soon. Bye bye.